All right, ladies and gentlemen. So today's lesson should be a fairly short screencast lesson, but it's one that basically directly builds off of what we've been looking at the past 2 days, and that is China's descent into isolation. Basically, how they do this complete and total 180, where they go from being kind of the world leader in terms of maritime strength and global exploration to being completely isolated from the rest of the world for about 450 years. Big takeaway of all this is that, it's during that 450 years then that China very much gets passed up, that other countries kind of move in and take that mantle of global leadership, and that China very much falls behind in terms of progress and innovation to the point where it becomes kind of a second rate power. So today we're going to, again, build off of yesterday's assignment about Ming exploration, and then we'll look at some of these policies employed by the Ming and later Qing dynasties, policies that were meant to dissuade any kind of foreign contact. Also, before we jump in, just to make a note that probably partway through this lesson, you probably will hear the school bell chime in. I apologize for that or any background noise, but thus is the challenges I'm up against when I'm trying to record a lesson here in Shaler Area High School during an active work day. So again, I'll apologize well in advance for that potential interruption. Now, as a starting point, this map, again, just kind of speaks to then the level of travel underwent by some of these Ming voyages of exploration, the ones that were ultimately commanded by Zheng He in his various voyages. Again, these fleets were amazing in size, very much not eclipsed until modern world history, probably circa World War I and World War II. We were basically talking floating cities here. Cities that were made up of hundreds of ships, not just these like massive treasure ships, but also all sorts of supporting ships, floating medical hospitals, trading ships, concubine ships, fishing ships. I mean, you name it, they had it in their armada. And what this map shows us is that is places that they went, from 1405 through 1433, that we can 100% verify based either on archaeological records that we have or records from the places that they visited. Of course, if you're somebody living in some far off city on the other side of the Indian Ocean, and all of a sudden some massive fleet of ships, 300 in size, of a people that you've never heard of before show up, chances are that people are going to write about that. People are going to try to document that experience. And so we do have a lot of those kind of records that exist from as far away as like now modern day Tanzania in Eastern Africa, ports that they put into in the Middle East, India, Sri Lanka, pretty much everywhere that you see documented on this map. Now, again, the mystery is, did they go farther? Did they go elsewhere? Were there fleets that maybe went in a direction that never came back? And a lot of that is frankly unverifiable. We have no evidence one way or the other. We have conjecture. Again, we have theories. One of the things that sometimes gets brought up by people is that to discount any other voyages is that people bring up the fact that, well, did they really have the motivations to go in any other direction? If they knew that there were lands in the direction that they were going to the west, and they kept running into shoreline, and they kept bringing back the maps and records, why would they head out across the Pacific Ocean where they had no significant data or documents whatsoever? So it's a valid point, but again, it's just conjecture, nothing that we can really firmly base anything off of whatsoever. This graphic just shows as kind of a closing point on this, some of the records that were left behind by Zheng He and his fleets. So oftentimes when they would put in at a port, in addition to maybe leaving some people behind, leaving some colonists behind, leading some merchants behind to buy up trade goods for future voyages, they would oftentimes also leave behind a tablet like this, basically commemorating their visit. It would say, in this day, in 1412, Zheng He and his fleet, put in at this port, and we brought, good tidings from the emperor, and yada, yada, yada. So a number of these do exist that, again, can corroborate some of the stories that we have from alternative perspectives. Now, the question then becomes, and the million-dollar question for this discussion then is, well, why did they stop? If the Chinese were doing such amazing things and they were going in farther and farther to the west, like, why didn't they just keep going? Like, why didn't they just round the Cape of Good Hope, and why don't they go all the way to Europe? Well, there's a few different theories that kind of get argued about and discussed to answer this question. One story that exists is that supposedly the Ming emperor that isolated was living in the Forbidden City. The Forbidden City had just gotten, finished up building when a random, terrible storm came over, again, mere days after the Forbidden City is finalized, and that a bolt of lightning comes crashing down on one of his newly built palaces, and it catches a bunch of the buildings on fire, and it supposedly kills his favorite concubine. So again, who knows if this story is true? It's not really verifiable, but the story at least speaks of the fact that the emperor saw this as a sign from the gods or from the heavens or from some kind of divine intervention, and that it was that caused him to change course, that we shouldn't be looking abroad, that we should instead be worried about things at home. Another theory that gets floated out there, and this is probably at least part of the answer as to why they isolated, was because, the emperor did have a number of Confucianist-based advisors that he surrounded himself with all the time. And that supposedly many of these Confucianist advisors were constantly saying to him, that China is the most perfect place on earth, that we're the most perfect society, that we're the most advanced society, and that these different ways of doing things are just inherently corrupting. That these other cultures give us nothing of value. And so that this is basically just a waste of our time. This is a waste of our money. And likewise, we need to look inward instead. So that's probably at least part of it, that there's probably some convincing of the emperor by other peoples. And then the third thing that gets brought up a lot, the one that's probably the most tangibly true, and the one that I would say I've read the most essays that pretty much speak to this being the prime reason for the isolation, was just a basic need for resource reallocation. Now, what I mean by that is that, let's say you have the national budget of China, and let's say that you are spending a huge percentage of that money every year building and maintaining this fleet and sending them abroad. That's money that you can't use for other projects. Well, we talked about the other day, the fact that the Ming had all sorts of big building projects that they were dabbling in all the time. They were financing stuff left and right. And that the most pressing of these big projects that they had on their plate was reconstructing the Great Wall of China. That China during the early 1400s was suffering from real threats from the north. I mean, you figure it wasn't that long before this, 1360s, that the Mongols had been chased out of China by these early Ming emperors, okay? Well, the Mongols were still there then on the front doorstep. They were still up there in Mongolia. They wanted to take China back. They kept on attacking. And so the Ming knew that they needed to solidify their northern defenses. And so what do? This is where they then commission the rebuilding of the Great Wall into what we know it is today. So, pictures like this where you see the Great Wall of China as this mostly brick construction that was all done during the Ming period, and it was primarily done after the end of Zheng He's fleet. So a lot of people say simply, hey, we scrapped Project XYZ, and we're taking all that money and all of those materials and all of those men, and we're transferring them to our northern border, and we're going to apply them to building the Great Wall, solidifying our northern defenses. And remember as well, when I'm citing this, this map here shows us the Great Wall as built by the Ming. Okay, and so you notice it's not just one straight linear wall. It kind of has a circle to it. It kind of zigzags. There's offshoots all over the place. But then you look at this map, and this map speaks to all of the different Great Walls of China that have ever been built. So you can go to different parts of China today and you can find remnants of various defensive walls built by different, emperors and dynasties throughout Chinese history. And they're all there to protect against the Mongols. The Mongols were the big threat for, again, hundreds and hundreds of years. But it reflects the fact that the borders were not where the borders are today, and that the borders of the Chinese state were kind of constantly in flux throughout the generations. So again, big picture, that's the main thing cited for this kind of abrupt shift in terms of Ming foreign policy. Now, it doesn't necessarily explain then why the eradication of all the records, because that's one thing that again, we know. We know that once the Ming emperor and his successors decide to isolate, that they don't just stop sending ships out, but rather they destroy all the maps, they destroy all the navigational logs, they destroy all the shipyards, they destroy the monuments. They literally tried to eradicate any speck of history that speaks to the fact that these voyages had ever even happened. And to me, that's scary. I mean, anytime that, you talk about people that want to erase history or cover up history, either good or bad, like here's an example of a period of time where you had the erasing of earlier history. And now here we are hundreds of years later trying to figure things out, and we really can't. But either way, they eradicate all of that stuff. And it's believed that it was done to dissuade future emperors and future explorers from trying to make the same mistakes, if you will. Like, well, people aren't going to be able to go and spend wastefully on these armadas and fleets if they have no idea where they're going in the first place, or if they don't know how to build ships. So again, it's this decision that's going to really put the Ming in later Chinese emperors at a tremendous disadvantage to their European counterparts. Now, I put on this next slide then a list of some of the restrictions then employed by the Ming and later Qing dynasties to discourage foreign trade and foreign interaction. Again, the goal here was isolationism. They wanted to cut themselves off from the rest of the world. They wanted to kind of just worry about themselves. And again, we see this in a lot of nations' histories, right? You see this in American history, where our country went through periods of time where politicians and the American public advocated for, hey, we should just worry about ourselves. We should say heck with the rest of the world. Well, what the Chinese do is that gradually, okay, this doesn't all happen overnight, they put in place a bunch of restrictions that didn't eliminate all foreign contact, but at least was meant to dissuade foreign contact. Okay. And what I always kind of envision is like, basically picture somebody putting enough restrictions or enough hoops that somebody has to jump through, that the person is just going to get sick of it and they're going to go away. They're going to give up, right? Well, if you want to come over to my house, you have to do the following 18 things first. Okay? Chances are if somebody would say that to you, you would say, "Well, heck with that. I'll just stay home. I'm not going to come over anyway." That was the goal of these kind of restrictions. It was meant to still be polite and deferential toward other people, but at the same time, trying to get them to just go away and leave the Chinese alone. Well, the first restriction, pretty major one, is that they directly limited trade to only 3 places. And at first, foreign trade, again, from the 1430s through probably the late 1700s, were only allowed to happen in actually 2 of these 3 places: the city of Canton and the city of Macau. Now, I also listed on here the city of Ningbo. Ningbo is added later on, as a result of foreign pressure. But just to show you where these areas are that I'm talking about here, so there's Canton and Macau. Okay, so both sit right at the end of what's called the Pearl River. That's a river that's not on this map that comes across southern China, empties out into the sea. And so you have this big kind of river delta area there. You have Canton at one end of that huge natural harbor. You have Macau at the other end. And then also not on this map, you also have Hong Kong that's located right there too. So Canton and Macau, if you're a foreigner, whether you're from Europe, whether you're from Japan, wherever you were from, you could only go to those two places to trade. And then later on, they added or opened up the port of Ningbo, which is located right outside of Shanghai at the mouth of the Yangtze River, another really important large river in central China. So for hundreds of years, that's the only places that you could go. Now, Macau is really interesting, especially because when the Europeans show up, okay, so the first Europeans to show up are going to be the Portuguese. And the Portuguese show up in 1514 and they try to establish trade. And for the longest time, they can't, make any inroads. Eventually, however, they're going to strike a deal with the Chinese officials. And the deal that they're going to strike is they say, okay, will you lease us all of Macau? Like you can see, it's actually a few islands, and there's a little bit right here at the tip of this peninsula. And so they basically say, will you lease us like this small little bit of territory here for us to set up our base? Let us have our, workshops. Let us have our warehouses. And they end up striking a deal with the Chinese officials to lease this for a whopping 45 pounds of silver per year. And they keep that lease in place for hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, why I bring this up whatsoever is that this is a picture of Macau today. Macau is like Hong Kong today in the sense that it's a part of China that has a completely different culture. And it's in part because of that hundreds of years of Portuguese influence. It is treated completely different than mainland China. So, different sets of rules. People that live there have different rights. They have different freedoms than people that live in kind of mainland communist China. But then the big thing is that Macau, dating back to the 1500s, became this big epicenter of gambling. And today, Macau is the gambling epicenter on earth. So I'm sure most of you think, like, when I say city that's synonymous with gambling, you probably think Las Vegas, right? Or maybe you think Reno, Nevada. Macau, I think, has something like 4 times the gambling revenue every year that Las Vegas brings in. So again, it's this period of history that basically creates that present imprint. In addition to limiting trade just to certain places, the Ming dynasties also pretty much fixed prices on all trade goods. So individual merchants could not haggle with one another. You could not go for, if you were European arriving there, you couldn't go shop to shop getting the best deal. It was set prices by the government. Those prices were generally set very high. There was generally extremely high excise taxes or sales taxes tacked on top of all of those. And you could only do business with government-approved merchants. So there was no free trade whatsoever. It was pretty much the approach of, okay, hey, if you're here for Chinese-made goods, if you want to buy Chinese tea, or you want to buy Chinese porcelain, or you want to buy Chinese silks, it was pretty much take it or leave it. Here's the product. Here's the cost. Yeah, it's super expensive, but you have no other alternative. So you either buy it at these high prices or you can go home. And of course, for especially Europeans that had traveled literally to the other side of the globe, oftentimes spent more than a year on ship to get to China, they were still going to pay. It was something that they resented, but it was still something that they could turn a profit on if they could get those products back to Europe. In addition to this, one thing that's not really a restriction, but that was a reflection of kind of the interaction between the Europeans and the Chinese, was that the Chinese would openly refer to the Europeans as barbarians. They would not sugarcoat this whatsoever. They would refer to you as a barbarian to your face. Now, remember, this is something that we see with a lot of societies. Right? When we talked about ancient Rome, we talked about how ancient Rome referred to these nomadic peoples from the east that spilled into the Roman Empire. They called them barbarians, right? So it's a very subjective, adjective here. Well, the reason why they referred to the Europeans as barbarians, or what they thought was so barbaric about them, was the fact that the Europeans didn't shower. That the Europeans had terrible, terrible hygiene. Whereas the Chinese, this was a very orderly, hygienic society. They understood the medical benefits of being hygienic and getting rid of human waste and showering and bathing on a regular basis, and even things like oral hygiene. They had an understanding of. So when they see these Europeans show up on their shores, and not only have they been on ship, oftentimes working hard in the hot tropical sun and super high humidity, but the fact that they also hadn't showered for a year or bathed in a year, to them, it was this kind of view of like, well, who the heck are these people? And why the heck would they ever think that we want to do business with them on an equal footing? Like, these people are less than us. So again, very much looking down at these foreign visitors, which is going to create a lot of building animosity when you talk about this treatment, continuing on for hundreds of years. Another thing, very humiliating for Europeans. But again, remember, all these were levied on any foreigners that arrived. So if you were an Arab and you showed up, you had to do this stuff too. Was that if you were doing business with a Chinese merchant, or you were meeting with a Chinese official, or you were trying to, get some trade deal done, you were always required to kowtow at the feet of that Chinese person prior to conducting the meeting. And what the heck does kowtow refer to? Well, it's this thing that you see down here in the bottom corner image. I mean, it literally means to bang one's head on the ground. So you would get down on hands and knees, you would hit your head or your forehead off of the ground, you would kind of get down real low to show that I am beneath thee, and then you would raise up and you would conduct the meeting. And then you would probably do this a second time at the conclusion of the meeting before you went your merry way. So again, here are these people, I can only go to certain places. They call me a barbarian. I'm paying through the nose for this stuff that I've came all the way around the world to get. They make me hit my head on the ground. Oh yeah, by the way, also I skipped over this one by accident. You had to speak a Chinese language. So if you were in Canton and Macau, the language down there, the typical language was a dialect called Cantonese, okay, named after Canton. Still spoken in that region today, different from Mandarin Chinese, which is kind of the more mainstream Chinese language. Had to kowtow at the feet of these officials to humiliate yourself one more time. And then finally, the big one, you had to pay in silver. From the Chinese perspective, they looked around and they said, okay, well, anything that you're selling, anything that you're bringing on your ships, Europeans, we can make too, we can produce as well, but we can produce better. We can one-up you. So the first Europeans, what do they show up with? What did they feel that they made well? Oh, well, we make things like clothing well. They show up with this European-made clothing, and the Chinese look at it and they say, we don't want that junk. We don't want European clothing. Or they show up and they bring jewelry. Oh, well, we can make jewelry even better than that. Or they show up and, hey, we make clocks. And the Chinese say, well, we've been making clocks for centuries that are more accurate than the clocks that you're making. The only thing that the Chinese were interested in, that they valued, that had worth to them, that they could not find domestically, was silver. The Chinese did not have a domestic source of silver. And increasingly, what the Chinese realize is that after, especially, the Europeans discover the Western Hemisphere, after the Spanish go into places like Mexico and Peru and parts of South America, all of a sudden the Europeans have a lot of access to silver. And where is a lot of that New World silver going? It's flowing across the world directly into Chinese coffers. It's going there to buy Chinese-made luxury goods. So again, this is super important to note, circle it, highlight it, bold it, whatever, because this is something that in a later unit, when we come back to China again, after 450 years of isolation, after 450 years of stagnation, of them saying, hey, we're only going to care about ourselves, we're not going to deal with the rest of the world. Well, what's eventually going to happen is that the Europeans are going to get way stronger. The Europeans are going to industrialize. The Europeans are going to have all these colonies. The Europeans are going to have all this wealth. And then they're going to look at the Chinese after 450 years of them kind of messing around, giving us the short end of the stick. And they're going to say, well, it's revenge time. We're not going to play nice anymore. We're not going to pay you in silver anymore. We're not going to do this kowtow thing anymore. And it's really going to set them on a collision course for conflict. To close, I made quick mention of the fact that, okay, these restrictions employed originally by the Ming, but then later also adopted and, if anything, strengthened and made stricter by the Qing dynasty. Yes, that's how you pronounce that, Qing. It's pronounced almost like it's a CH. Well, who are the Qing dynasty? Well, the Qings are actually from Manchuria. They're from this region of China up here in northern China, totally different ethnic group altogether than your typical Han Chinese, and they end up overthrowing the Mings in 1644. They take over China. And so if you wonder, well, like when we looked at some of those other maps, and showed China being smaller, or those other dynastic empires being smaller, what empire or what dynasty basically makes China into what it is today territorially? It's pretty much the Qings. It's only from the 1640s onward that they controlled regions like Manchuria, that they controlled regions like Xinjiang out here in northwestern China. They controlled places like Tibet. These were regions that were not traditionally part of China until the past 350 years or so. So we'll end there. Tomorrow, then, when we get back together, we will build off of this by shifting our attention back west and looking at the roots of European exploration. So our power centers are all kind of stagnant. Our power centers on Earth really aren't doing much. So what's going to then be the motivation for the Europeans to go out and explore and conquer everywhere?